The night I turned 16, the moon split open and showed me her face. I do not know how else to describe it. One moment I was standing at the edge of the courtyard, oil smoke from the great torches rising in slow columns above the gathered pack of Stonehaven, my new cloak heavy on my shoulders, my father's hand brief and proud on my back, and the next, the moonlight shifted. The noise of the ceremony dropped to nothing. Every scent, every voice, every flicker of firelight went still, and I saw, with a clarity I had never felt before or since in waking life, a woman I had never met standing in a pale courtyard I did not recognize. She was not looking at me. She was looking up, head tilted slightly, watching something above her, a moon fire, I thought, though the shape of the flame was wrong for any fire I knew. Her hair was loose, the color of turned earth in good light. Her hands were at her sides, open and unhurried, the way a person stands when they feel entirely safe. And on her left wrist, just below the heel of her palm, there was a faint mark, the shape of a crescent, very pale, as though it had just arrived and was still deciding whether to stay. Then someone said my name, my father's steward, calling me back to the Rite. The vision dissolved, and I was standing again in my own courtyard with oil smoke in my throat and the pack watching me, and the mark on my own left wrist was warm. I did not tell my father. I was 16, and the warden's sons were watching, and my father had spent 6 months making sure the coming-of-age rite went without incident. And I understood, with the particular clarity of being very young and very proud, that telling my father that the moon had just shown me a stranger's face was not the kind of thing a future king said out loud. So I said nothing, and the rite continued, and the pack raised their cups, and the moon moved on. But the mark did not cool. Even after the courtyard emptied and the torches burned down to coals, the crescent on my wrist stayed warm. Not hot, not the flare that the Moonseer texts described for a bond igniting. Just warm. A low, steady warmth, like the last heat held in hearthstone long after the fire is banked. I pressed my thumb against it in the dark of my chamber that night and thought, she is somewhere. She is real. She felt this too, and she is standing somewhere under the same moon, and someday I am going to find her. I want to tell you that I was right, and that finding her was swift and easy, and that I had her home and safe before the year was out. I was right, it was not swift, it took 12 years. The council arranged my marriage the following spring. I was 17. She was Lady Isara of the Aldenmore pack, 17 herself, steady-eyed and sensible, the middle daughter of a respected northern house. My father, who had been king for 30 years and who knew that a kingdom needed alliances the way a roof needs rafters, sat across from me at the long table and laid out the logic plainly. The northern roads were contested, the Aldenmore pack commanded 3 mountain passes, and Isara was well regarded in 2 territories. It was not a cruelty. My father was not a cruel man. I thought of the woman in the vision. I thought of the warm mark on my wrist. I thought of my father's careful, reasonable face, and the 30 years he had carried this kingdom, and I said yes. Isara was not the woman the moon had shown me, and she knew it, and I knew it, and we were both, in our own fashions, too honest to pretend otherwise. But she was kind. We were kind to each other. There were evenings by the fire when she would read aloud from the old pack histories, and I would sit across from her and feel something quieter than longing, a companionable sadness, perhaps, or simply the shape of a good thing that was not quite the right thing. I kept the crescent mark covered with my cuff at all times. I did not tell her about it. That felt like the one small mercy I could offer. She died in the 6th year of our marriage, a winter illness, fast and unsparing, the kind that takes the strong ones without warning. The pack Moonseer said it was painless. I hoped that was true. I kept her sitting room as she had left it for nearly a year, the histories stacked on the side table, her reading candles burned down to nubbins, before I finally let the maids clear it. The mark on my wrist was still warm. I spent the next 3 years being a reasonable king. I held the northern roads. I rebuilt the Aldenmore alliance through treaty rather than marriage. I sat in council and I heard disputes, and I signed the documents my steward placed before me, and I was, by every outward measure, functioning. My pack was fed and safe, and the walls of Stonehaven were sound. The great hall rang with the ordinary business of a kingdom moving through its seasons, and I moved through it with the steady, responsible attention my father had taught me. But I was also, quietly and persistently, going mad with a question I did not know how to ask. Where are you? Because the mark had not cooled. That was the thing none of the texts prepared me for, not the warm pull of it, which I had lived with so long it had become as ordinary as the weight of my boots, but the direction. I do not know how to say this precisely. I had no words for it when it began, and I am not sure I have better ones now. It was not like hearing a voice or seeing a sign. It was more like when you have been asleep and you wake in an unfamiliar room and you do not know for a moment which way is north, and then something in your body finds it. Not your eyes, something older than your eyes. That is what it was like. The mark would warm slightly at certain hours, and I would find myself turned without intending it in a particular direction. North and east, always north and east. I did not act on it for 3 years. I was a king. I had a kingdom. I could not simply set off north and east because a scar on my wrist felt warm. I tried. I gave myself arguments. I had council sessions on my calendar, a dispute in the Southern Territory that wanted personal attention, a trade agreement with the Valley Lords that required 3 months of careful correspondence. I told myself that a bond mark without a name or a location was not a road. It was a feeling, and feelings were not the instrument of kings. I was quite firm about this, in the privacy of my own head, until it stopped working, which happened about 18 months after Isara died, and after which I was simply a king who had a kingdom and who was also, under the surface of all that reasonable governance, pointing north and east like a compass needle. It was my old Monsieur who finally said the word I had been refusing to say. Aldrich was 80, which in our pack meant he had seen 6 kings and outlasted the memories of everyone who might have argued with him about anything. He had been my father's Monsieur before he was mine, and he had the particular privilege of the very old and very trusted, which is that he said exactly what he thought whether or not it was convenient. He came to my study on a Tuesday in early autumn, unannounced, which he did sometimes and which I had long since stopped objecting to. He sat down across from me, without being asked, and looked at my left hand where it rested on the desk and said, "You are going to have to go and find her." I looked up. "I do not know where she is." "North and east," Aldrich said. I sat with that for a moment. "The mark has been warm for 12 years, I said. "If the bond were going to tell me something useful it would have done it before now." "The bond is patient," Aldrich said. "It has waited 12 years. It will wait another 12, but you will not last another 12, my lord. You have the look of a man who has been holding his breath since he was 16 years old." I did not answer that, because it was true, and answering it would not have helped. "She is alive," Aldrich said. "The mark is warm, not cold. If she had died, it would have gone cold. It has been warm since the night of your Rite, which means she has been alive and waiting and north and east of you for all of this time." He looked at me for a long moment across the cluttered desk. "The Aldenmore trade road runs north and east. It passes through 4 border settlements in the first 100 miles, and then the high country roads fan out toward Ashfin and the Greywall territories." I would start at Ashfin. "You have thought about this a great deal," I said. "I have thought about nothing else for 3 years," Aldrich said, pleasantly, "since you clearly were not going to think about it yourself." He stood to go, and then paused at the door and looked back at me with the particular quality he had, not soft, exactly, but sure. "She has been carrying the mark too," he said. "Whatever she is, wherever she is, she has had it since the same night you did, and she has been living with it without knowing what it means or who it belongs to. The least you can do is go and tell her." He left. I sat for a long time looking at the maps on my desk. Then I called for Call. I left on a Tuesday in late autumn, 2 weeks after that conversation. I took 6 men, enough to manage the road without making an event of it, not so many that I would arrive at a border village like a military column and frighten everyone into hiding. I left Devant, my second in command, holding Stonehaven with full authority. I told the council I was making a routine survey of the northern passes. They did not entirely believe me. Devant, who had served me for 11 years and who knew my face better than most, stood at the gate and said nothing, and then said, "Should I expect you in a month, my lord, or longer?" "I do not know," I said honestly. "Longer then," Devant said, and stood back and let me ride. The mark on my wrist was warmer than it had been in years. The road north ran through forest for the first 2 days, pine and birch, the light going silver and brief through branches beginning to lose their leaves. The days were cold and clean. My men kept a respectful silence most of the time, which I was grateful for. I was not fit company. I kept turning the same questions over in the rhythm of the horse's hooves. What if the mark was simply old scar tissue and the warmth was imaginary? What if she had died years ago and the warmth had never faded, the way a ghost of heat stays in cooling stone long after the fire is out? What if I found her and she was bonded to another? That last one was the one that kept me up on the first night, lying on the hard ground in a camp off the road, listening to the horses shift and the fire settle. It was not jealousy exactly, not the sharp, possessive thing. It was more like grief, a preemptive grief for something I might have missed the only chance at. I had let duty hold me in place for 12 years while the bond mark stayed warm on my wrist, and she, whoever she was, wherever she was, had been living her life north and east of me. If she had found someone else in 12 years, someone who had not been slow and reasonable and dutiful, I had no one to blame but myself. The thought sat in my chest like a stone, and I stared at the fire and waited for morning. The border settlements were not it. The first was a market town 2 days north called Grenfell, a solid place, prosperous, a proper pack hall and 3 inns. We stopped for the night and I sat in the common room of the best inn and waited for something to stir, and nothing did. The mark was warm but directional. It did not flare. It simply pulled. I asked the innkeeper whether there were notable healers further north, and he gave me 3 names in 2 different settlements, and I wrote them down and felt nothing at the writing. The second was a smaller place, a river crossing with a name I have since forgotten, where a ferryman's wife looked at my crest and decided she had an obligation to report the king's passage to the nearest pack warden. I thanked her, and we were gone before the report could produce any complications. 3 days further north, we came through Irongate, a stockade town on the edge of the high forest, useful and hard-working and not the place. Nothing in me stirred when we rode in through the gate except the habitual alertness of a man used to assessing new ground. I bought provisions and asked, in a general way, whether there were any notable healers in the northern settlements. The innkeeper's wife, who was clearly interested in the well-made traveling clothes of a man who was clearly not simply a merchant, mentioned a woman at the Ashfin House of Healing, 3 days' ride up the mountain road. She was considered gifted, the innkeeper's wife said. She had come to Ashfin when she was very young after her mother died, and she had been there ever since, just her and the old moonseer and the wolves she tended. A quiet life, very quiet. The kind of life that doesn't attract much notice. I thanked her and we left before she could wonder too long about why a well-equipped man was riding north in early winter, asking about healers. The 3 days between Irongate and Ashfin were the longest of the journey. The road climbed as we went, the forest thinning to high country pines and then to open valley, the snow deeper here and undisturbed except by animal tracks, deer mostly, and the large padded prints of wild wolves moving along the tree line. We passed a shepherd's hold on the second day, smoke rising from its chimney, dogs barking at the perimeter. We passed a frozen waterfall on the 3rd morning, the ice pale blue in the cold light, the sound of the water underneath it entirely absent, the whole face of the cliff silent and held. It was very beautiful, I thought. She has been living 3 days' ride from a frozen waterfall her whole adult life, and I did not know her name. On the third afternoon, Call rode beside me for a while and said nothing, and then said, "My lord, the mark is warm." "It has been warm for 12 years, I said. "It is different now," Call said. He had been with me long enough to have noticed the mark on my wrist in unguarded moments, and he was not a man who spoke without something to say. "The last 2 days, warm is not the word for it anymore." I looked down at my left hand on the rein. The crescent was visible even through my cuff, a faint luminescence in the gray winter light, like a coal through fabric. I had been aware of it for hours. "No," I said, "it isn't." "Close," he said. "Yes," I said. We rode the last hour in silence, and the mark grew brighter. The mark on my wrist grew steadily warmer with every mile, and I stopped trying to interpret it and simply let it lead me, the way you let a rope lead you through dark water when you cannot see, and you have decided to trust the thing it is tied to. Ashvin was not much. A cluster of stone and timber buildings at the edge of a high valley, the kind of place that had been there for 300 years because the valley was sheltered and the water was good, and that would probably still be there 300 years from now for the same reasons. A mill on the stream, a market square with a stone well, a small pack hall of modest stone with a carved moon above its lintel. And at the far edge of the village, set back slightly from the road, a long, low building of pale stone with another carved moon above its door, the House of Healing. A stone wall bounded its yard, and the gate was open, and there was a wolf lying on its side just inside the gate with a woman crouched beside it. We came in at midday. The valley was quiet. A light snow had fallen in the night, and the rooftops were white, and smoke rose in thin columns from the chimneys, and the whole place had the particular stillness of a settlement that has made its peace with winter and is not troubled by it. My mark went from warm to blazing. I pulled my horse up without meaning to. The sensation was not painful. I want to be clear about that. It was more like the moment you step into a room with a fire after an hour out in the cold, when the warmth hits you so fully it almost stuns you, and for a second your whole body goes still before it remembers how to move. I pressed my left hand against my thigh and made myself breathe slowly and tried to collect myself, because I was the Alpha King of Stonehaven, and I was not going to fall off my horse in a border village, because a scar on my wrist had decided to blaze. Call, my young soldier who noticed things, said very quietly from slightly behind me, "My lord, at the gate." I looked up. She was crouched down beside a wolf that lay on its side at the gate of the healer's yard, one forepaw extended toward her. She was wrapping the paw with clean white cloth, her movements careful and unhurried. She had her back to me. Her hair was loose, the color of turned earth in good light. I knew her from the back before she turned. The mark on my wrist was blazing. She must have heard the horses because she looked up and over her shoulder, and then she stood and turned to face us, and I looked at her face. It was the face from the vision. Exactly, completely, unmistakably, the way a thing you have dreamed for years wakes with you in the morning and is suddenly all around you in the real light, undeniable and plain and present. I had been carrying that face for 12 years, and now there it was, 20 feet away, looking at me across the cold yard of a small border village, and the mark on my wrist was blazing. She looked at me and went very still. Not frightened, I want to be clear about that too. She did not look frightened. She looked like a person who has just heard their name called from a great distance by a voice they recognize but cannot quite place, that arrested, searching expression. Her eyes were dark and steady. Her hands were still at her sides, open and unhurried, exactly as they had been in the vision 12 years ago. Then she looked down at her left wrist. I looked at mine. The crescents were blazing, both of them, hers pale and luminous under her rolled sleeve, mine burning gold against my skin, and the warmth that had been a quiet, steady thing for 12 years became, in that moment, something larger. Not dramatic, not thunderous, nothing like the great flaring the old texts described when a bond ignited between a king and his true mate in the ceremony hall before a gathered pack. This was not that. This was quieter and more complete than that, more like a door opening that had always been gently ajar, more like a room that had been slightly cold for 12 years becoming, at last, the temperature it was always meant to be. We looked at each other across the snowed yard for what might have been 10 seconds and might have been 10 years. Then the wolf she had been tending lifted its head and looked at me, and its tail moved once, twice, against the snow. The slow, certain wag of an animal that has made up its mind about something and is not going to change it. "You have been riding a long way," she said. Her voice was even and careful with a slight northern inflection. "That horse needs water." My men were very quiet behind me. "Yes," I said. "She does." I dismounted. Her name was Myra. She had been the lead healer at the Ashfin House of Healing for 4 years, having trained under the previous healer, an old woman called Nesta, who had died the previous winter. Before that, she had been Nesta's apprentice for 8 years. Before that, she had come to Ashfin at 14, 2 years after her mother's death, because Nesta had been her mother's friend and had sent a letter and had come to collect her personally when Myra was too proud to reply to the letter. She had been here since. She had no pack name, no ceremony standing, no family left that she knew of. The village regarded her with the particular fondness reserved for someone whose presence they had become so accustomed to that they had almost stopped noticing it was something a person chose. She told me none of this on the first day. On the first day, she watered my horse and directed my men to the healer's stable and fed them from the healer's kitchen. And she and I sat across from each other at the long table in the healer's hall and looked at each other with the particular care of people who are not yet sure how much to say or how fast to say it. The wolf, whose name, as near as I could make out from the way she addressed him, was simply Wolf, lay under the table with his bandaged paw extended and his large yellow eyes moving between us with calm interest. "You are Stonehaven," she said. It was not a question. She had recognized the crest on my men's cloaks. "Yes," I said. "The Alpha King." "Yes." She was quiet a moment, turning her cup in her hands. She had a healer's hands, not rough exactly, but capable, familiar with work. She wore no jewels, no pack marks, nothing to show rank or station because she had none to show. A healer in a small border village, unremarked by the world. The world had seen very little in her, and she had gone on healing its wolves in spite of it. "The mark," she said. "Yes," I said. "I felt it," she said. 12 years ago, the night of the moon fire, I was 16. I was standing in the village square here and the fire went up, and I felt the warmth on my wrist, and I saw your face." I had spent 12 years wondering if she had felt it. 12 years of that solitary, particular uncertainty. The question of whether the vision had been one way, whether I was the only one marked, whether I had been fool enough to build 12 years of patience out of something that had touched only me. The relief of hearing her say it was so complete that for a moment I genuinely could not speak. "I did not know what to do with it," she said honestly. She was not softening the edge of it. She was simply reporting the truth as she understood it. I was a girl with no pack name and no standing in a small village, and I had been shown the face of someone I did not know. "I could not exactly go looking for you." "No," I said, "you could not." "And there was the matter," she said carefully, "of the Lady of Stonehaven." "She died," I said, 3 years ago, a winter illness." Myra looked at me steadily, not measuring how I felt about it, the way some people looked, watching for weakness or grief, or the particular flinching that people do when they are not yet ready to have a conversation. She looked as though she was simply establishing the plain facts of it, clearly and without ornamentation. "I am sorry," she said. "So am I," said. "She was a good woman. She deserved better than a husband whose wrist was warm for someone else. It was the most honest thing I had said out loud in 3 years, and it surprised both of us. Myra looked at her cup. I looked at the wolf under the table, who had not moved. "You rode all the way from Stonehaven," she said. "North and east," I said. It took me a while to admit that was where I was going. A corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "How long have you been riding?" 11 days. She looked up. 11 days. "I should have come sooner," I said. "I am aware." "You were married," she said, without accusation. Simply the fact of it. I was. And then I was a widower managing a kingdom which held me in place another 3 years. And then my old moonseer sat down across from me and said, very pleasantly, that if I didn't go north and east immediately, I would have the look of a man holding his breath until I died. I paused. He was right. I had the look. Myra set her cup down. "What do you want?" she asked. She asked it plainly, the way she asked everything, no softening, no scaffolding, just the direct question. I understood that she was a woman who had been doing without unnecessary framing for most of her life, and who did not intend to start using it now for my convenience. "I want you to come home to Stonehaven," I said, which was also the plainest answer and which I had not rehearsed and which came out sounding more like a fact than a request. I recovered quickly. "When you are ready, if you are willing. I am not going to command it. I would stay here another week or a month or however long it takes for you to trust this enough to consider it. And then I am asking, not arranging, not ordering, asking if you will come back with me." Myra looked at me for a long time. "I have 18 wolves in the infirmary," she said at last. "I know," I said. "I will wait." She stood up and moved to the window that looked over the healer's yard, where the afternoon light was falling cold and clear on the snow. She was quiet a long time. I did not push. I had not ridden 11 days in early winter to push. "I have been here since I was 14, she said finally. "I do not know what I would be somewhere else." "You would be a healer," I said. "I have healers at Stonehaven. Not as good as you, apparently, but they would know what you were, and so would the wolves." Another small movement at the corner of her mouth. "The wolf," she said, with a slight nod toward the animal under the table. "He seems to have made up his mind already," I said. "He makes up his mind very quickly about strangers," Myra said, "usually not in their favor." "I feel," I said carefully, "that I should take that as a good sign." She turned from the window and looked at me, and this time the corner of her mouth gave up and became, quietly, a real smile. Not large, she was not a woman who did things largely, I was already understanding that, but real and warm, and it undid something in my chest that had been quietly closed since I was 16 years old, standing in a courtyard with oil smoke in my throat, and a vision dissolving back into noise. "You can stay in the village," she said. "There is an inn, it is not very much." "I have slept on the ground for 11 nights, I said. "An inn sounds like extraordinary luxury." "Good," she said. "Then you can stay. In the morning you can help me with rounds if you are willing to be useful in a healer's ward and not merely decorative, and we can talk." She said it with a slight pause, as though the word was larger than it appeared. "There is a great deal I would want to know before I agreed to anything." "There is a great deal I would want to tell you," I said. "I stayed 10 days. I do not know how to write about those 10 days without making them sound smaller than they were. They were not dramatic. Nothing burst through the gate with a revelation. No ceremony occurred. The wolves in the infirmary healed at their own pace, and Myra moved through the ward with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who has learned that urgency and rushing are not the same thing, and I followed at a respectful distance and watched and occasionally asked questions that I hoped were useful and probably sometimes were not. I cleaned. This is the honest truth of it. I cleaned wolf bedding and fetched water and held a lamp steady while she checked stitching, and I sanded the worn parts of a table that had become a hazard to anyone walking past it in the dim morning. She assigned these tasks without apology, and I completed them without objection, and something about the exchange, the quiet plainness of it, the way she treated work as simply the thing that needed doing and not a performance, was more restoring than any ceremony I had ever sat through. I learned in those 10 days a great many things. I learned that Nesta had come to find her, not waited for her to arrive, but gone and found her personally, a girl alone in a small settlement 3 days east, with a mother newly dead and a father long since gone and no one who particularly meant to look after her. Nesta had known her mother years before, and when she heard of the death she had sent a letter, and when the letter went unanswered, she had traveled there herself and found Myra, 14 and fiercely self-contained, managing a house she had no means to heat and going to bed hungry rather than accept what she called charity. Nesta had not called it charity. Nesta had called it a training position and offered pay, and Myra had considered this for approximately a day and a half and then said yes. I learned that she had, by habit so old it had become invisible to her, a way of putting herself last, not from weakness, not from poor self-regard, but from a kind of bone-deep practicality. The wolves needed tending, the work needed doing. She was there and capable, and therefore she did it. She had been doing it since she was 14, in Nesta's infirmary and then in her own. The village adored her for it in the vague, slightly guilty way that people adore those who quietly make their lives easier. She had very rarely adored herself for anything. I learned that the mark on her wrist had been, for 12 years, a source of private bewilderment that she had ultimately resolved by a decision so characteristic of her that I could not have predicted it and could, in retrospect, have predicted nothing else. She had decided that it was moon business, that it would eventually explain itself, and that in the meantime there was work to do. She had pressed her thumb to it on her first night in Asheville, at 14, and in a handful of quiet evenings since, and on those evenings she had noticed that the warmth intensified if she faced a particular direction, north and west. She had faced it and felt it and turned back to the work. When I told her that, I had to excuse myself from the healer's kitchen for a moment. I stood in the yard in the cold and breathed carefully and looked at the sky, because I had been carrying the weight of those 12 years as a kind of solitary thing, a private, patient waiting that was also a private, patient ache, and suddenly it was not solitary. She had been standing in the same story from the other side, feeling the same warmth, facing the same direction, doing the same work of ordinary patience, and neither of us had known. I stood in the yard until I was certain I could speak normally, and then I went back inside. On the 4th day she asked me about my life. I told her carefully. My father, the duty marriage, Isara, the 3 years of managing the kingdom while the mark stayed warm and the direction stayed north and east. She listened the way she did everything, entirely, without interrupting, taking all of it in before she said anything at all. "Did you love her?" she asked at the end. "Your wife?" I thought about it. I respected her very much, I said. I cared for her. I was not kind to her in the way she deserved, because I could not give her the part of myself that belonged to someone I hadn't met. But I was faithful to her in every way within my reach, and I grieve her, and I think she deserved to be the whole story for someone, and not a chapter placed in the way of something else. Myra was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is honest." "You asked for the truth," I said. "I always do," she said. "It saves time." On the 5th day, the wolves in the infirmary began to follow me. Not metaphorically, literally, physically, the wolves in the infirmary began to follow me when I moved through the ward. I noticed it first with the gray male who had been brought in with a shoulder wound, and who had been deeply skeptical of everyone except Myra since his arrival. On the 5th morning, he levered himself off his pallet and limped after me when I walked to the supply room for fresh cloth, and sat outside the door and waited. And when I came out, he walked back beside me at my knee with the settled air of a wolf who has decided something permanent. On the 6th day, she showed me the infirmary records. Not because I had asked. I had been careful not to ask for anything she had not already offered, because she was a woman who gave things on her own terms, and to whom being pressed was a kind of insult. She brought them to the kitchen table after the evening rounds, a leather-bound book worn soft with use, and she opened it to the current month and turned it so I could see. Each entry was precise. The wolf's name if known, the nature of the injury, the treatment, the prognosis, the date of arrival and the expected date of release. Her hand was small and very clear. Every notation was sufficient and nothing more. 23 this month, I said, looking at the entries. It was a hard autumn, she said. The high country packs lost 2 territories in a border dispute, and the wolves that were displaced came south disoriented. Several of them arrived in very poor condition. I looked at the entries. 3 of them had notes in a different column. No pack, no name, origin unknown. These ones, I said. They are not claimed by anyone, she said. When they are well, they stay if they want to. 3 have stayed this past year. Wolf was one of them. I looked under the table. Wolf looked back at me with the yellow eyes and the steady certainty of an animal who has made all his decisions and is not reviewing them. He arrived in the spring, Myra said. Someone had set a trap. He was very angry about everything for the first 2 weeks, and then one morning he simply wasn't, and he sat down next to the south wall and has been there since. She looked at him. He is very good at decisions, she said. He makes them quickly and he holds to them. I had noticed, I said. She closed the record book and rested her hands on it for a moment. In Stonehaven, she said carefully, the unclaimed wolves, what happens to them? I looked at her. They are rehomed to willing packs, I said. The healer's wing keeps records. There are wolves in the high country territories, she said, that no pack will take because they are old or because their injuries leave them with permanent limits. They are not dangerous. They are simply not useful in the way that packs require usefulness. She said it without bitterness, just the fact. Send me the records, I said. When you come, I will find them a place. She looked at me for a moment. Then she picked up the record book and set it aside and said, You are making a great many promises. I know, I said. I am going to hold you to all of them, she said. I know that too, I said. That is why I am only making ones I intend to keep. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I believe you, she said, which was, from a woman who had learned to believe only what she had reason to, the most generous thing she had said to me yet. I mentioned this to Myra. She looked at the 4 wolves and then at me with an expression that occupied the narrow territory between amusement and resigned acknowledgement. They know, she said. They know what? That you belong to this place, or that this place belongs to you. They are not very precise about the distinction. She paused. Wolf has not left your side in 3 days. I looked down. Wolf, the one she had been tending at the gate, was at my left knee, the bandaged paw resting carefully on my boot, the yellow eyes looking up at me with a great calm certainty. He does not like strangers, Myra said for the second time with the same fond exasperation. He has liked you since the first afternoon. I have been thinking about what that means. What have you decided? She looked at me steadily with the frank directness she brought to everything. I have decided, she said, that I would like to see Stonehaven. On the 7th day, I told her the whole story. All of it, the ceremony at 16, the vision, the way it had dissolved back into the courtyard noise and the mark had stayed warm, and every year after that. The duty marriage. The warmth of the mark through Isara's life and after it. The 3 years of pointing north and east in the privacy of my own chest. The Tuesday in autumn when Aldrich sat down across my desk and said what I had been refusing to say. She sat very still while I talked, her hands around her cup. When I finished, she said, The moon fire in the village square. Yes, I said. We were the same age, she said, the same night. Yes. She looked at her wrist. The crescent was not blazing now. It had settled to the warm, steady glow it had found on the first afternoon. "I thought it was the fire," she said, "the reflection of the moon fire on my skin." I spent about 2 years explaining it that way before I stopped explaining it, and simply accepted that I did not know what it was, and probably would not unless something told me. "Now you know," I said. "Now I know," she said. She was quiet for a moment longer. "You could have looked harder," she said then, very quietly, not as an accusation, I thought, but as the statement of a plain truth. "In 12 years, you knew the direction." "I know," I said. "You had a kingdom," she said. "I understand that. I am not saying it as a reproach. I am saying it because I want you to know that I understand the shape of those 12 years, that they were not nothing, that they were also something you carried." I looked at her across the table. Outside, the afternoon had gone gray with coming snow, and the fire in the hearth was the warmest light in the room, and Wolf was asleep under the table. "I carried them," I said. "I am sorry they were so long." She was quiet again. Then she looked down at her wrist, at the crescent still warm and steady in the firelight. 10 years, she said, meaning the span from when I had been free to the present. "Of being reasonable." "I would not recommend it," I said. The corner of her mouth moved. "No," she said, "I do not imagine you would." She picked up her cup, set it down again, and looked at me with that clear-eyed quality she had, the quality of a person who has decided to look at things directly and simply report what they see. "I am going to say yes," she said. "I want to be honest with you about that I have been thinking about it since the first afternoon, and the answer is yes. But I want to do it properly. I do not want to rush away from a place I have given my whole life to." "Then we will do it properly," I said. On the 8th day, the old moonseer of Ashfin came to find me. His name was Cale, perhaps 60, small and bright-eyed, carrying a carved moon staff, 30 years the moonseer of this valley. He found me in the healer's yard in the morning and looked at my left wrist with an expression of great satisfaction. "Later than expected," he said. "I have heard," I said. "I have watched her carry that mark for 12 years, he said, without preamble. On certain evenings, when it went particularly warm, she would stand at the window and face north and west and stand there for a minute or two and then go back to work." He paused. "She never said anything about it to anyone. That is not her way. But I knew, from the quality of the mark, what it was. I kept waiting for you to come." "I was late," I said. "Yes," Cale said simply. "Now, I want you to understand what you are asking of Ashfin when you ask her to leave. This village has had her since she was 14 years old. It has kept her quietly, not unkindly, but out of sight. A healer in a border village is useful and valued, and also, always, a little less than the thing she actually is. She has given everything here. She has kept her account cleanly. She will not complain about it, and she will not ask to be compensated for it, because that is not the kind of woman she is. So I am telling you." I looked at the old moonseer for a moment. "I hear you," I said. "She will need the valley to be well," he said, "before she can leave with her whole heart." "She will have it," I said. "I will make sure of it." Cale looked at me with his bright, patient eyes. Then he nodded once. "Good," he said, and walked back through the healer's gate. On the 9th day, Myra asked me what I intended. We were in the healer's kitchen, late afternoon, the rounds done. She was measuring herbs into 2 cups and I was at the kitchen table, and the light was the amber of early winter late afternoon, when the sun is low, and the snow catches it, and the world goes briefly gold. "I intend," I said, "to bring you home to Stonehaven as my Luna, to present you to my pack with the full ceremony the bond deserves, to give you time, as much as you need, to know the place and the people, and decide what you want your life there to look like, and to spend the rest of my time as a king being the kind of man who is worth the 12-year wait." I had thought about that. I am not going to pretend otherwise, but thinking about a thing does not make it untrue. Myra brought the cups to the table and sat across from me and wrapped her hands around hers and looked at it, and then at me. The wolves here will need someone, she said. We will find someone good, I said. There is a girl in Irongate, the innkeeper's wife mentioned her. 15, very talented, you were going to send for her in the spring. Sina, she said, looking at me. Send for her now, I said. I will fund the training from Stonehaven's treasury. You stay until she can manage. I will wait. Myra looked at me for a long time. That is a generous offer. It is not generosity, I said. It is what is right. I would rather Ashvin have a good healer for the next 40 years than have you rushed away from a place you have served your whole life. Sina starts now. You stay until she is ready, and Ashvin is not left without its healer. She looked at the cup. The crescent on her wrist caught the gold light and glowed, steady and unhurried. 3 months, she said, at minimum. 3 months is nothing, I said, to a man who waited 12 years. She looked up, and for a moment there was something in her face that was very close to tears, not sad ones, but the other kind, the kind that come when something arrives that you did not expect to be given, and that is more than you knew how to ask for. Yes, she said, then again quieter, yes, I will come to Stonehaven. Wolf, under the table, thumped his tail against the floor 3 times. I went home the next morning to prepare. The arrangements were considerable. A chamber, a place in the healer's wing, the pack notified, a ceremony planned. I left the next morning with my 6 men, and the valley road south was cold and clear, and I had gone perhaps a mile from the village gate when Call said quietly, "My lord, look back." I turned in the saddle. Myra was standing at the edge of the road where it curved out of sight of the village, Wolf beside her with his bandaged paw held carefully above the snow. She had her hand resting on his head. She raised her other hand when I turned, a simple, unhurried gesture, the kind that requires nothing. I raised mine. She turned back toward the village. I turned south. Sina came from Irongate in 10 days. A serious-faced girl with capable hands who reminded me, when Myra sent her description, of a young version of Myra herself, the same bone-deep practicality, the same absence of waste. The training began. Letters came and went through the winter on the Stonehaven road. I wrote about the pack, a dispute between 2 families in the Eastern Territory that had been running for 3 years and had finally, after considerable effort and 2 long mediations, resolved. A council session about the mountain passes that had taken 4 days and produced a workable agreement and also a great deal of gray in my hair. The healer's wing at Stonehaven being expanded at the north end. The new rooms fitted with the proper shelving and ventilation that Aldrich had sourced from the old Moonseer texts. A litter of 5 wolf pups born in the stable yard in a December snowstorm, all of them healthy, all of them loud. Myra wrote about the infirmary. Sina's first solo treatment, a minor sprain, handled well. A case in late November that had worried her, a wolf brought in with a fever she didn't immediately recognize, which had resolved in 4 days with a treatment she described in precise clinical detail that I could not follow and found entirely reassuring because she clearly could. A night of heavy snow in December that had blocked the valley road for 6 days. Wolf, who had been managing the new wolves in the ward with what she described as an authority I never gave him and that appears to be working. The moon fire on the shortest night of the year, which she had watched from the healer's yard, and the warmth of the mark on her wrist, and the direction it faced. That last letter I read 3 times. I sat in my study at Stonehaven in January with snow on the window glass and the fire low and the letter on the desk, and I thought about a woman standing in a healer's yard in a border village feeling a warmth on her wrist and turning toward the south and west, and I thought about the 12 years before that when she had been doing the same thing and had had no name to put to it. I wrote back the next morning. I told her about the pups. I told her about the council resolution. I told her that the mark on my wrist in January, with the snow and the low fire and her letter on the desk, was the warmest it had been since I rode home from Ashvin in November. I told her that the room felt less cold than it had been. She wrote back 8 days later and said, "This is a well-run kingdom, it seems, for a man who has been pointing north and east with half his attention for 12 years. Then, the mark is warm. Then, at the very end, in her precise small hand, I will be ready in March." Aldrich read one of the letters over my shoulder, not because he had been invited to, but because he had decided decades ago that such conventions did not apply to him, and said, "She writes well." "She does," I said. "Direct," he said, "honest. No waste." He set the letter down and looked at me with the knowing quality he had, the 80 years of reading people and the quality of their silences. "You look better." "I feel better," I said. "You look like someone has given you back your breath," he said. He was not wrong. She arrived in the spring. A bright morning in late April, the kind of northern morning that comes after a long winter and is almost aggressively clean, the light sharp and cool, the sky a clear blue above the thawed roads, the smell of pine and cold earth and something almost green beginning in the soil. I had not slept well the previous night. I had been awake since before the 4th hour, sitting at my desk doing no useful work, and I had ridden the estate roads at dawn because standing still in a room was not something I was capable of. Devant found me on the west road at sunrise and fell into step beside me and said nothing for a while, which was one of the things I valued most about him, and then said, "She arrives at midday, my lord. You have time to eat." "I am not hungry," I said. "You are going to meet the future Luna of Stonehaven on an empty stomach," Devant said pleasantly, "looking as though you have been awake since before dawn and have been riding around the estate in the dark." "I have been awake since before dawn," I said. "I have been riding around the estate." "Yes," Devant said, "come and eat." I ate. I changed my clothes. I was at the gate when the road from the north produced my 6 men, and the cart and Myra on a dark horse, riding straight-backed and unhurried, Wolf's traveling crate roped to the side of the cart and Wolf himself visible through the slats, entirely done with being in a crate and communicating this clearly with his eyes. She dismounted at the gate of Stonehaven. I was there to meet her. She looked at the walls, the courtyard, the gathered pack who had come to see their king bring home a Luna, took it all in with that same steady quality, present and unhurried, understanding before feeling. Then she looked at me. "It is large," she said. "It is," I said. "You will know every corner in a month." "The wolves," she said, looking at the pack wolves gathered near the stable yard, 8 of them, drawn by something none of them could have named but all of them felt. "They have been unsettled all week," I said. "Aldrich says they knew you were coming." The 8 wolves moved collectively toward her. The nearest, a big silver female, 9 years with me, who tolerated perhaps 4 people, put her nose gently against Myra's open hand. Myra stood still and let her, and looked at the wolf, and then at me, and then at the gathered pack watching from the walls and the yard. "I am going to need a proper infirmary," she said. "Done," I said. "Being prepared as we speak. And Sina, when her training is finished, has a place here if she wants one," I said. "I have already written." Myra breathed out slowly. Then she lifted her left hand, wrist up, the crescent pale and luminous in the April light. I took it in both of mine. The marks met. The warmth that had been a quiet, patient, private thing for 12 years became, in that moment, simply itself, full and open and unhurried, the way something feels when it has waited a long time and is no longer required to wait. The pack was very still. The silver wolf sat down and placed her great head across our joined hands and closed her eyes. Aldrich, near the gate, said to no one in particular, "There it is." We were married at the summer ceremony. A simple rite, as she preferred, though simple still meant the great hall of Stonehaven lit by 100 candles, and the full pack gathered and Aldrich conducting the bond rite with the solemnity he brought to everything he had decided mattered. Myra wore a dress the color of clean linen, and she walked in without ceremony and stood beside me, and looked at me steadily all the way through. I am not going to pretend I remember every word of the rite. I remember the candlelight on the stone and the smell of pine resin from the torches and the great quiet of a hall that is holding its breath, and I remember Aldrich's voice, steady and unhurried, saying the words that have been said in that hall for 300 years. And I remember the moment when he spoke the binding clause and I looked at Myra, and she was looking at me with those clear, steady eyes, and there was no ceremony in her face and no performance. Just the same quality she had brought to everything since the first afternoon at the Ashfin Gate. Present, honest, entirely here. I thought, this is the face from the vision. This is the face I have been carrying since I was 16 years old. Here she is, in the candlelight looking at me. The mark on my wrist is blazing. Everything that has been quietly waiting for 12 years is done with waiting. The pack bowed at the end of the rite, not because ceremony required it, because the wolves had decided first, and the pack had watched the wolves, and no one needed to be told what it meant. The low, collective bow of a hall that has witnessed something it recognizes as right. Myra looked at the bowing hall. They did not have to do that, she said quietly. No, I said. It is a great deal of fuss for a healer from Ashfin, she said. Get used to it, I said. The corner of her mouth moved, a full smile this time, not the careful, restrained thing from the early days in Ashfin, but something broader and more real, the smile of someone who has decided to let themselves have something they spent 12 years not quite allowing themselves to want. Not cautiously, not guardedly, simply having it the way she had always done the work when the work needed doing, wholly, without reservation. Wolf, given a place at the edge of the ceremony floor after extended negotiations with the steward, lifted his head and wagged his tail twice. Devant, near the back of the hall, caught my eye and gave me the particular look of a man who has been holding a kingdom together for 3 years while his king pointed north and east, and is very pleased indeed to have the matter resolved. I have been asked sometimes which moment it truly began, the vision at 16, or the Tuesday when Aldrich told me to ride, or the afternoon at the Ashfin Gate when the face from the vision looked back at me across the snow. I have no clean answer. It began the night the moon showed me a stranger's face and left a warm mark on my wrist, and it continued, quietly and stubbornly, through every year I spent being a reasonable king in a kingdom that needed one, through the duty marriage and the grief, and the 3 years of pointing north and east in the privacy of my own chest. It arrived on a bright morning in late April, when a healer from a small border village put her hand in mine in the courtyard of Stonehaven, and the wolves sat down, and the pack bowed, and everything that had been waiting opened at last. I kept the mark covered for 12 years. I will not cover it again.